The radio crackled with static as I adjusted the volume, listening for updates from the search teams scattered throughout the forest. I had been a park ranger for years, but no amount of experience ever made these searches any easier. A missing camper always stirred up that sickening mix of hope and dread. This time, it was Lily, a young girl who had vanished 2 days ago. Her friend Owen had been with her at the start of the trip, but she had wandered off, and by the time he realized, she was already gone. Owen blamed himself for losing her, and I could see the guilt weighing on him as we set out that morning. Joining us was Tom, a volunteer who insisted on helping, eager but inexperienced. He'd meant well, but I worried his enthusiasm might become a liability. We scoured the forest for hours, calling out Lily's name, following every trail, every broken branch. I knew these woods better than anyone, but with each passing hour, the forest seemed to grow thicker, as if it was trying to keep her hidden. Then, just as the sun began to dip behind the treetops, we found her. Lily was standing in a small clearing, dazed and disoriented, her clothes dirty and torn. Relief flooded through me. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange, her backpack. It wasn't just hers. It contained supplies that shouldn't have been there. A small knife, a flashlight she didn't own, and food she hadn't packed. Lily looked up at me with wide, confused eyes. "I don't remember," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Lily couldn't tell us much. She didn't know where she had been or how she'd survived for 2 days alone. There were gaps in her memory, and every time we tried to piece together what happened, she grew more frustrated. Owen, her friend, wasn't convinced. "You're hiding something," he said, his voice tense. I had to step between them to calm things down before it escalated. "We'll figure it out," I told them both. "But we need to keep moving." We decided to follow Lily's scattered memories, hoping they'd lead us to wherever she had spent those missing days. Tom, eager to prove himself, offered to scout ahead. His enthusiasm was admirable, but I kept a close eye on him. These woods were not forgiving to the careless. As we pushed deeper into the forest, we came across something that stopped us in our tracks, an abandoned campsite. The tents were old, their fabric rotting and brittle, but the fire pit showed signs of recent use. Someone had been here, and not long ago. Lily stared at the campsite with a strange look in her eyes, as if something about it was familiar. I've seen this place before," she murmured. But when we pressed her for details, she shook her head, unable to explain further. The further we ventured into the forest, the more uneasy everyone became. Owen grew impatient, snapping at Lily whenever she hesitated or seemed uncertain. "You know more than you're telling us," he accused her. "You just don't want to say it." I kept reminding myself that Owen's frustration came from fear, from guilt, but it was wearing on all of us. Tom, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to the tension, focusing instead on impressing everyone with his enthusiasm. He pushed ahead recklessly, ignoring my warnings to stay close to the group. I tried to keep the team focused, but the forest had a way of pulling at your mind, making every decision feel heavier, every noise more threatening. As night began to fall, the atmosphere shifted. The noises started quietly, twigs snapping under unseen footsteps, leaves rustling in the windless air. It was as if the forest had come alive, watching us, waiting. I glanced over at Tom and saw the nervous energy in his eyes. "We should stop for the night," I said, though I knew sleep wouldn't come easily for any of us. In the dead of night, the forest around us came alive with sounds, soft footsteps circling the campsite, just beyond the reach of our flashlights. I strained to see through the trees, but all I could make out were shifting shadows. "We're not alone," Owen whispered. Tom, determined to prove himself, grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the edge of the camp. "I'll check it out," he said before I could stop him. "Tom, wait," I called after him, but he was already gone, his flashlight beam bobbing through the darkness. Minutes passed, then an hour. Tom didn't come back. We called his name, but the only response was the distant rustling of leaves. Finally, we found his flashlight, flickering weakly on the ground, the beam cutting through the dark like a dying firefly. There was no sign of Tom, no struggle, no footprints. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. By morning, the forest had fallen into an eerie silence. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned us. Lily sat quietly by the remains of the fire, her knees drawn to her chest, while Owen paced back and forth, muttering to himself. "We need to go," he said finally, his voice sharp with panic. "We can't stay here, not after what happened to Tom." He was right. I hated the thought of leaving Tom behind, but staying wasn't an option. We were exhausted, shaken, and the forest felt more dangerous with each passing hour. We packed up quickly, making our way toward the trailhead in grim silence. The air was heavy with defeat, and every step felt like a retreat. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see Tom running toward us, laughing at the prank he had pulled. But he never came. We were close to the edge of the forest when I saw it, a figure standing far off between the trees, too distant to make out clearly. My heart skipped a beat, hope flaring inside me. "Tom," I called, squinting through the branches, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I knew in that moment it wasn't Tom. "Come on," I said quietly to Owen and Lily, urging them forward. "We're almost there." We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead, the trees thinning behind us. When I glanced back one last time, the figure was gone. We went straight to the authorities to report Tom's disappearance. I told them everything, about the noises, the abandoned campsite, and the figure in the woods. They listened, but I could tell they didn't believe us. A search operation was launched the next day, but it didn't turn up anything. No footprints, no traces, no sign that Tom had ever been there. The forest had swallowed him whole, just as it had tried to swallow Lily. Days passed, and the search was called off. Tom's disappearance became another unsolved mystery, another name whispered among the trees. I returned to my duties as a ranger, but something had changed. The forest felt different now, quieter, more watchful. Lily and Owen tried to move on, though I knew the weight of what had happened would stay with them. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about that figure in the trees. Who or what had been watching us that day? I still patrol the forest, walking the same paths, listening for familiar sounds. But the forest has kept its secrets, and Tom remains missing. The rain began to fall as I pulled into the driveway of the cottage, fat drops splattering against the windshield. The house stood alone at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by thick forest. It looked exactly like the pictures, quaint and rustic, with ivy creeping up the stone chimney and a porch swing that swayed gently in the wind. I had booked this place to escape the constant hum of the city, the endless deadlines, and the exhaustion that clung to me like a second skin. Nate, the host, had been friendly enough in our messages, though his final text had been strange. "Don't worry about any noises you might hear. This old house gets loud during storms." I had dismissed it as quirky advice at the time, but now, standing in the cold rain with the message still fresh in my mind, it unsettled me. I shook off the feeling, grabbed my bags, and headed inside. The moment I stepped through the door, warmth enveloped me, the smell of cedarwood, a fire crackling in the hearth, and soft lamps casting a cozy glow across the wooden walls. It was perfect, just what I needed. I made tea, curled up in a blanket, and listened to the soothing sound of rain tapping against the windows. For the first time in weeks, I felt myself begin to relax. As the storm picked up, the atmosphere in the cottage began to change. The wind howled through the trees, and rain drummed heavily against the roof. It wasn't the kind of comforting storm I had imagined. It was relentless, wild, and loud. The house itself seemed to react to the weather, creaking and groaning as if protesting the onslaught. At first I told myself it was just an old building adjusting to the elements, but then the sounds became harder to ignore, a faint knock at the front door, followed by a creak from the floorboards upstairs. I stood perfectly still, straining to hear over the storm. It had to be the wind, I thought. Houses made noises all the time during storms, right? But a gnawing unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The knocks were too deliberate, the creaks too heavy. It was as if someone was moving through the house, just out of sight. The first knock at the front door was soft, barely audible over the storm. When I checked, the porch was empty, just rain splashing against the wood and the porch swing swaying in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, probably a loose branch knocking against the wall. But the sounds continued. Footsteps from the second floor, the faintest rustling inside the walls, and then the most unnerving one of all, a knock, deliberate and sharp, from the inside of the bedroom closet. My heart raced as I stared at the closet door, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but logic kept me rooted in place. It had to be the wind. There was no other explanation. I grabbed my phone and texted Nate, asking if anyone else was supposed to be at the house. Minutes passed with no reply. I sat on the edge of the bed, flashlight in hand, waiting for a response that never came. The storm raged outside as I finally mustered the courage to approach the closet. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in my hand as I reached for the door. I pulled it open in one quick motion, heart pounding. The flashlight revealed nothing but empty hangers, swaying gently on the metal rod. They clinked softly, as if they had been disturbed only moments before. I stared into the empty space, relief washing over me in a slow, uneven wave. It was just my imagination, I told myself. There was nothing to fear. Then the footsteps resumed, louder this time, heavier, coming from the second floor. The sound was unmistakable, deliberate, steady steps descending the staircase. My phone buzzed in my hand, a message from Nate. I opened it, and my stomach dropped as I read the words. I should have mentioned, "Don't go near the closet, just leave now, I'll explain later." I stared at the message, my heart hammering in my chest. Just leave now. The words repeated in my mind like a mantra, urging me to move, but fear had locked me in place. I glanced at the closet one last time, half expecting something to emerge from the shadows within. Then came the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, descending the stairs. Whoever was upstairs was no longer trying to stay hidden. They were coming down step by step with the kind of calm that made my skin crawl. I bolted for the front door, gripping the handle and twisting it hard. It didn't move. I tried again, wrenching it with all my strength, but the lock wouldn't turn. It was jammed, or someone had locked it from the outside. The footsteps were closer now, echoing through the small cottage. I could feel them vibrating through the floorboards. Panic surged through me. I had to get out. I had to get out now. I grabbed the nearest chair and swung it toward the window. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, the storm outside roaring as wind and rain poured into the room. I glanced over my shoulder, but the staircase was still empty, for now. Without another thought, I hoisted myself through the window, landing hard on the wet ground outside. The cold rain stung my skin, and the wind whipped my hair across my face, but I didn't care. I had to get away from that house. Lightning split the sky, and in the brief flash of light, I saw it, a figure at the top of the stairs, staring down at me. It wasn't Nate. It was someone else, someone I didn't recognize, and they had been inside the house the entire time, watching me. I scrambled to my feet, slipping on the wet grass, and ran toward the forest. The storm was relentless, and every gust of wind felt like it would knock me off my feet, but I kept going, heart pounding in my ears. I didn't stop until the house was far behind me, swallowed by the night. Rain battered me from all sides as I stumbled deeper into the forest, searching for any sign of shelter. The cold seeped into my bones, and my clothes clung to my skin, heavy with water. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A small, abandoned hut nestled among the trees. I pushed the door open, the wood creaking loudly in protest, and stepped inside. It was empty except for a few broken chairs and a rotting table, but it was dry. I collapsed against the wall, shivering uncontrollably as the storm raged outside. Every noise made me jump, the creak of the door in the wind, the rustling of leaves outside. I curled into myself, hugging my knees, waiting for dawn. The hours dragged by, each one more suffocating than the last. I felt like I was being watched, even here, even now. But I knew I couldn't go back to the house. The storm showed no signs of letting up, but eventually exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The storm finally broke just before dawn, leaving the forest eerily silent in its wake. The only sound was the distant drip of water from the branches overhead. I waited until the first light filtered through the trees before leaving the hut, my legs stiff and unsteady beneath me. The walk back to the cottage felt surreal, like moving through a dream. The broken window gaped open, the house silent and still, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't dare go back inside. Instead, I found my car, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook uncontrollably. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, the house disappearing behind me. The storm might have passed, but the fear clung to me, thick and suffocating. The wind whispered through the trees as I approached the recluse's house, the town's infamous abandoned property. I had heard stories about it for years, how the owner had vanished without a trace, leaving everything behind. It was the perfect place for an urban explorer like me. The house stood alone at the end of a dirt road, its roof sagging under the weight of years, windows fogged with grime. Even in decay, it held a strange beauty, a reminder of what once had been. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I crossed the threshold, the old wooden door groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rot and wet wood. The wallpaper, once vibrant, now peeled from the walls in long strips, and dust lay thick across the floorboards. This was exactly what I had come for, the beauty of decay, the stories hidden in every corner. I pulled out my camera and began snapping photos, eager to capture the house before time consumed it entirely. I moved from room to room, documenting the eerie remains of a life left behind. A dining table sat in the corner, fully set with plates and silverware, as though dinner had been interrupted decades ago. Upstairs, I found clothes neatly folded on a bed, and in the living room, a fire lay ready in the hearth, untouched for who knew how long. It was strange, unsettling even. The house didn't feel abandoned. It felt suspended, frozen in time, as if someone had meant to come back but never did. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood beneath my feet. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I brushed the thought aside, trying to focus on the architecture, the details, but the uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. As I continued through the house, something caught my eye. A thin layer of dust coated every surface, untouched by time, except for the path my footsteps had traced through the rooms. I paused, glancing back at the trail I had left behind. That's when I saw it. A second set of footprints, faint but unmistakable, trailing behind me in the dust. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't noticed them before. The footprints didn't match mine. They were larger, heavier, and led deeper into the house, toward the back. For a moment I stood frozen, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself they were old, a relic from someone who had come here before me. But the more I looked, the fresher they seemed. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here recently, or was still here now. I turned to leave, my instincts screaming at me to get out. But as I reached the front hall, I froze. There, by the door, sat a pair of boots, old, worn, and covered in mud. They hadn't been there when I entered. The sound of wood creaking upstairs made me whip around, my flashlight beam jerking wildly. Then came the knocks. 3, deliberate, resonating through the house like a warning. I knew I should leave, knew that every second I stayed put me in danger. But something pulled at me, some irrational need to see what lay upstairs. My legs moved before I could stop them, carrying me toward the staircase. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, each one louder than the last. I reached the top and stared down the narrow hallway, at the door standing slightly ajar at the end. The flashlight flickered in my hand, and I felt the air grow heavy with anticipation. I crept down the hallway, each step feeling like a betrayal of my own survival instincts. The narrow corridor seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark, and the faint smell of dust and old wood filled the air. My flashlight flickered again, making the shadows dance along the walls. At the end of the hallway, the door stood slightly open. I hesitated for a moment, heart pounding in my chest, and then nudged it open with the beam of my flashlight. The door creaked loudly, the sound amplified by the silence around me. Inside, the room was bare except for 2 men lying on the floor. For a brief moment, I thought they might be asleep, or worse. But then, in one jarring instant, their eyes snapped open, locking onto me. A wave of terror gripped me, freezing me in place. They didn't speak. They didn't hesitate. They scrambled to their feet and bolted toward me, eyes wild and full of intent. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis. I spun on my heel and sprinted down the hallway, adrenaline flooding my veins. Behind me, the pounding of their footsteps echoed in the confined space, chasing me through the house. I hurtled down the staircase 2 steps at a time, nearly losing my balance as the old wood groaned beneath my weight. I could hear them close behind, their breathing ragged and heavy. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but I knew one thing: I couldn't let them catch me. I raced through the house, dodging past the dinner table and careening into doorways, desperate to put distance between myself and the two men. The house seemed to twist and turn endlessly, the same rooms appearing again and again like a labyrinth. I could hear them gaining on me, relentless and silent. I spotted the back door and threw it open, bursting into the cold night air. But they followed, their heavy footsteps still pounding behind me. There was no time to stop. I ran into the forest, the underbrush clawing at my legs as I fought my way deeper into the darkness. The forest was dense, the branches slapping against my face as I tore through the undergrowth. The men were still behind me, their heavy footsteps crunching leaves and snapping twigs as they followed close. My lungs burned, and my muscles screamed, but I didn't dare slow down. The only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears and the relentless footfalls behind me. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw it. A river, wide and fast-moving, cutting through the forest. With no other option, I sprinted toward the water and leaped, plunging into the icy current. The cold hit me like a punch, knocking the breath from my lungs, but I forced myself to keep swimming, letting the current carry me away from the men. The river's pull was strong, dragging me downstream. I glanced back toward the bank, where the two men stood, searching frantically for a way to follow. But the water had already taken me beyond their reach, and soon they disappeared from sight, swallowed by the darkness. The river eventually slowed, allowing me to pull myself onto the muddy bank, gasping for air. My whole body trembled from the cold, and my clothes clung to me, soaked through. I lay there for a few moments, the forest quiet around me, except for the distant rush of the river. Once I caught my breath, I forced myself to stand, shivering uncontrollably. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I had to keep moving. The men were still out there somewhere, and I couldn't risk staying in one place. I stumbled through the forest, each step heavier than the last, until I found a narrow path winding through the trees. It led me out of the woods and back toward the town, the distant glow of streetlights guiding me like a lifeline. When I finally reached home, exhaustion overtook me. I collapsed onto my bed, too tired to process what had happened. But even in the safety of my apartment, the events of the night haunted me. The forest seemed to grow thicker the deeper I ventured, the air cooler and still, as if the woods were holding their breath. I had heard rumors of an old estate buried somewhere out here, abandoned for decades and hidden beneath a canopy of branches. The stories about its mysterious past only added to its appeal. The house appeared suddenly through the trees, a skeletal structure standing defiant against time. Ivy clung to the walls, and the windows were fogged with dirt and cracks, like blind eyes staring out into the forest. A thrill ran through me as I stepped closer, my boots crunching on dead leaves and brittle twigs. The front door groaned as I pushed it open, revealing a dark interior that smelled of rot and damp wood. Dust hung in the air, stirred by the faint breeze that followed me inside. Old photographs lined the walls, faded memories of people long gone. Broken furniture cluttered the rooms, and strange symbols were scratched into the wood, as if someone had tried to leave a message that time had nearly erased. I explored deeper into the house, each room more unsettling than the last. The walls seemed to sag under the weight of forgotten years, and every step dust swirling in the stale air. But the real pull came from the basement door, half hidden in the corner of the kitchen. The wooden steps groaned under my weight as I descended into the darkness, the air growing thick and cold. At the bottom, the beam of my flashlight swept across the damp walls and landed on a figure, Sophia. She was chained to the wall, her eyes wide with fear. Her clothes were ragged, and her skin was so pale it seemed translucent. She looked like she had been there for months, if not longer. "We have to go," she whispered urgently, her voice cracking. "He'll be back soon." My heart raced as I fumbled with the rusted chains, my hands shaking. Before I could ask who she was talking about, I heard it. Footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. The warden was coming. There was no time to think. I yanked at the chains until they snapped, the metal groaning in protest. Sophia swayed on her feet, and I wrapped an arm around her, half carrying her to the nearest window. The broken glass scratched my hands as I pushed her through first, then followed close behind. We hit the ground hard, the cold forest floor unforgiving beneath us. The night was thick with mist, and every sound seemed amplified. The rustling leaves, the distant howl of the wind, and the heavy crunch of footsteps behind us. We ran, branches clawing at our skin as we fought our way through the forest. Sophia stumbled, her legs too weak from captivity, but I caught her just in time. The loose stones beneath her feet tumbled noisily down the hill, and I knew in that moment we had given ourselves away. Behind us, the warden's footsteps came to a halt. He knew. We pushed deeper into the forest, our breath ragged and cold in the night air. Every branch that cracked beneath our feet felt like a beacon calling out to him. Fear drove us forward, even though Sophia could barely stand. The forest seemed endless, every twisted tree and shadow blending into the next. My legs burned, but I couldn't stop, not when I could feel him closing in. Finally, we burst through the trees and stumbled onto the road, the mist swirling around our feet. For a moment, the world was silent. It felt like we had outrun him, like we were finally free. But when I turned to Sophia, her face was pale with fear. "We're not safe yet," she whispered. "He always finds his way back." We moved off the road, slipping into the dense underbrush as Sophia insisted we keep going. The air was heavy with moisture and the forest felt alive, branches swaying, leaves whispering in the wind. I could feel the warden's presence, somewhere behind us, his silent pursuit growing closer with every step. After what felt like hours of running, we stumbled upon a small cave, half hidden beneath a rock outcrop. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. We crawled inside, pressing ourselves against the cold stone walls, trying to control our breathing. The opening gave us just enough of a view of the forest beyond, a narrow window into the dark. We huddled together, straining to hear every sound outside. Branches cracked in the distance, and then came the soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps. The warden was close, too close. My pulse thundered in my ears as I watched, helpless, as his shadowed form moved through the trees, searching. For a brief moment, I thought we were safe, but before I could react, something struck the back of my head. Pain exploded in my skull, and the world went dark. When I woke, the forest was silent, except for the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. My head throbbed, and it took me a moment to remember where I was and what had happened. Sophia was gone. I struggled to my feet, swaying from the blow to my head. Panic surged through me as I realized the warden must have taken her. I had to find her. I couldn't leave her to whatever fate awaited her back at that house. The forest blurred around me as I stumbled back toward the estate, driven by adrenaline and fear. When I reached the house, it loomed in the moonlight, silent and foreboding. The door creaked open under my hand, and I made my way through the decayed rooms, my heart pounding in my chest. The basement was empty. The chains that had bound Sophia still hung from the wall, rusted and broken. She wasn't here, but I could feel the warden nearby, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. Then I heard it, the faint sound of movement from deep within the woods. I sprinted into the forest, driven by instinct. The branches tore at my skin, but I didn't care. The only thing that mattered was finding Sophia. The distant sound of footsteps led me through the undergrowth, and then I saw them, the warden dragging Sophia, her body slumped in exhaustion. I slowed my pace, moving as quietly as I could. I spotted a large branch lying on the forest floor and grabbed it, my knuckles white with tension. Every step toward them felt like a lifetime, but I couldn't hesitate. When I was close enough, I swung the branch with all my strength. The crack of wood meeting skull echoed through the night, and the warden collapsed, his grip on Sophia loosening. I grabbed her arm and pulled her away, her eyes wide with fear but filled with relief. "Come on," I whispered, helping her to her feet. We didn't wait to see if the warden would get up. We ran, our footsteps pounding through the forest, driven by pure survival. The forest felt endless, but we kept moving, the memory of the warden's pursuit propelling us forward. My body ached from exhaustion, and Sophia could barely stand, but the thought of him finding us again was enough to keep us going. After what felt like an eternity, We stumbled upon a small village, nestled at the edge of the forest. Lights flickered in the windows, a beacon of safety in the darkness. We staggered into the first house we saw, pounding on the door until someone opened it. The warmth of the house wrapped around us as we collapsed inside, finally safe. A kind stranger brought us blankets and water, but even in the safety of the village, I couldn't shake the feeling that the warden was still out there. The gravel road stretched endlessly before me, weaving between towering pines. I hadn't seen another soul for miles, exactly what I wanted. The weight of the city, the crowds, the noise, and the endless stream of demands had finally become too much. I needed a break. A weekend alone in the wilderness seemed like the perfect way to recharge. No phone, no emails, just me and the forest. When I finally found the right spot, I knew it instantly. A small, secluded clearing far off the main trail. It looked untouched, as if no one had been there for years. A patch of flat ground sat nestled between trees, with a small ridge on one side, sheltering it from the wind. I set up my tent and sat back, listening to the breeze rustling the leaves. I could feel the tension in my chest ease with every passing second. This was exactly what I needed. As the day wore on, the sky darkened. Clouds rolled in, thick and gray, threatening rain. I welcomed it. A bit of rain would only add to the atmosphere, I thought. But when the first drops fell, I quickly realized it was more than just a passing shower. Within minutes, it turned into a relentless downpour. I retreated into my tent, settling into my sleeping bag. The rain drummed against the nylon fabric, a soothing, rhythmic sound that made my eyes grow heavy. I thought it was the perfect lullaby for a restful night. I couldn't have been more wrong. The rain wasn't letting up. Hours passed, and the steady tapping on the tent walls became a constant companion. It should have been comforting, but something gnawed at the back of my mind, a vague unease I couldn't quite place. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of being alone, far from civilization. At some point, I unzipped the tent flap to check the clearing. I didn't know what I was expecting, just a habit, I guess. The rain poured relentlessly, and everything beyond a few feet was a blur of shifting shadows. As I scanned the clearing, a flicker of movement caught my eye. A shape stood at the edge of the forest, barely visible through the sheets of rain. My heart skipped. I blinked hard, thinking it was just a trick of the light, but with every flash of lightning, the shape remained. It was a person, standing perfectly still, facing my tent. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a tree or a strange shadow. But no matter how many excuses I made, the figure didn't disappear. Another flash of lightning lit up the clearing, and it was closer now. I retreated back into my tent, zipping the flap shut with trembling hands. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me in the rain. But the unease settled deep into my chest and refused to leave. Minutes passed, and just as I began to convince myself that everything was fine, I heard it. The soft squelch of footsteps in the mud. Slow, deliberate, circling the tent. My breath hitched. I stayed completely still, listening to the faint, rhythmic sound moving around me. The rain muffled everything, making it hard to tell exactly where the footsteps were coming from. I reached for my flashlight with shaking hands and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the tent wall. A shadow shifted just outside. Something crouched low, pressing close to the fabric as if listening. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, frozen in place, and then, as quickly as it had come, the shape vanished into the rain. I knew I couldn't stay here. The figure was out there, somewhere in the storm. The rain made every sound ambiguous, every shadow deceptive. But I had no choice. I needed to leave, and I needed to leave fast. I scrambled to pack up my gear, but the rain made everything harder. The tent poles wouldn't come loose, and my fingers slipped on the wet fabric. My hands fumbled through the task, clumsy and panicked. Just as I was about to finish, the footsteps returned. This time, they came from the trail leading into the forest. My heart raced as I shined my flashlight into the darkness. There it was again, the figure, standing at the edge of the forest, perfectly still. Lightning flashed, and the figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I threw the last of my gear into my pack and bolted for the trail. The rain showed no signs of stopping. My boots sank into the mud with every step, slowing me down. I sprinted along the trail as best I could, but the waterlogged path made it feel like running through quicksand. My breathing was ragged, and my heartbeat drummed in my ears, but I refused to stop. The footsteps followed me, distant but deliberate. They never rushed or faltered, as if whoever or whatever was following me knew I couldn't get far. I dared not look back. Every instinct told me to keep moving, that looking back would only confirm what I didn't want to know. The figure was still there. The trees blurred past me, their trunks slick with rain. The trail twisted and turned, and more than once I nearly lost my footing. I stumbled but kept going. The weight of my soaked backpack made every step harder, but I didn't dare drop it. It was all I had. Somewhere along the way, I lost track of time. All I knew was that the trail seemed endless, stretching far beyond what I remembered. The rain distorted everything, making the forest feel like a maze with no way out. Still, I ran, and the footsteps followed, never too close but never far behind. When I finally saw the gravel road, I thought I was safe. Relief surged through me as I burst from the trail and stumbled onto the road, mud splattering my legs. I bent over, gasping for breath, my body trembling from exhaustion. For a moment the rain seemed lighter, the sound of footsteps gone. I leaned against a tree, letting the cold bark press into my back as I tried to convince myself it was over. The figure was gone. I was safe. Then I heard it, a scream, distant but unmistakable, rising from the depths of the forest I had just escaped. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was human, sharp and raw, cutting through the rain like a blade. The sound jolted me upright, and my breath hitched painfully in my chest. The scream came again, more frantic this time, echoing through the trees. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was someone else out there? Or had the figure found a new way to taunt me? I couldn't stand still any longer. I had to move, even though every step away from the forest felt like running from an unfinished nightmare. I ran again, even though my legs screamed in protest. The scream from the forest echoed in my mind, a haunting reminder that the nightmare wasn't over. Every sound around me, every rustling leaf, every crack of a branch, felt like a threat. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Paranoia took hold. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced that the figure was still out there, following me, waiting for the right moment to strike. My clothes clung to my skin, and the cold seeped into my bones, making every movement harder. The rain distorted everything. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly before me, like a cruel joke. I felt like a rat trapped in a maze, running without knowing where I was going. Every time I slowed down, the footsteps seemed to return, faint but deliberate, just far enough away to keep me running. The thought of stopping was unbearable. I had to keep moving. I had to get away, even if I didn't know what I was running from. After what felt like hours, I stumbled onto a rural highway, my legs barely supporting me. The rain had let up slightly, but the sky remained a deep, oppressive gray. I waved frantically at the first car I saw, a lone vehicle cutting through the gloom. The car slowed, and the driver rolled down the window, asking if I needed help. I didn't hesitate. I yanked open the door and threw myself inside, my body trembling from exhaustion and fear. As the car pulled away, I slumped against the seat, feeling the tension begin to ease. I was safe, finally. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then died with a pitiful whine. I slammed my hand against the steering wheel, cursing my luck. The snowstorm had hit earlier than the weather forecast promised, and now here I was, stranded on a desolate highway with no sign of life for miles. I pulled my phone from my pocket, but the screen was black. No charge. Perfect. The cold seeped through the windows of my dead car, gnawing at me through my thin jacket. There was no way I could stay here. I had to walk. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I trudged forward, the wind cutting through my clothes like a knife. Every step felt like a battle, my limbs growing heavier with each passing minute. I kept glancing over my shoulder, hoping for headlights, but the road behind me remained empty and dark. Just as I started to think I wouldn't make it, a pair of headlights appeared on the horizon, glowing faintly through the falling snow. Relief flooded my chest. I waved my arms frantically, and the old sedan slowed to a stop beside me. The car door groaned as I pulled it open. Warmth hit me, a welcome contrast to the icy wind. I slid into the passenger seat and slammed the door shut, rubbing my frozen hands together. "Thanks," I muttered, my voice hoarse from the cold. The driver gave me a polite nod, his expression calm and collected. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed neatly in a dark coat. Everything about him seemed ordinary. And yet something felt off, an intangible wrongness I couldn't quite place. The interior of the car smelled strange, like damp leather mixed with old perfume. It wasn't unpleasant, but it unsettled me all the same. The heater hummed softly, but the air inside the car remained cold, as though the warmth couldn't penetrate the space fully. As we drove, the man made light conversation, weather, work, small talk, but his words felt rehearsed, like lines from a script. I found myself glancing at him more often than I wanted, watching the way his lips curled into a smile that never reached his eyes. Then I saw it, a folded blanket in the back seat, with the edge of a pair of boots sticking out from beneath it. My chest tightened. Someone else had been in the car recently, but where were they now? The snow fell harder, turning the highway into a blur of white. The car's wipers struggled to keep up, the rubber blades screeching against the glass. The driver squinted through the windshield, then smiled. "Shortcut up ahead," he said softly. "We'll get you out of this storm quicker." My gut twisted. I knew this road. There were no shortcuts, only miles of empty wilderness. But I was trapped. With the storm raging outside, I had no choice but to stay in the car and hope for the best. The sedan veered off the highway onto a narrow, unmarked road, the tires crunching over fresh snow. Trees loomed on either side, their branches heavy with ice. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, and the deeper we drove, the more the unease in my chest grew. I wanted to ask why we were taking this road, but something told me not to. The man's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles pale in the dim light. He hummed a soft tune under his breath, a haunting melody that made my skin crawl. The sedan rolled to a stop at the edge of a dense forest. Snow swirled in the headlights, the storm swallowing everything beyond the beam of light. "We're here," the driver said, his voice calm but heavy with something I couldn't name. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. He turned to me slowly, his smile stretching just a little too wide. "I'd keep that door shut if I were you," he whispered. "It's worse out there than in here." Before I could respond, he opened his door and stepped into the storm. I watched in stunned silence as he walked around to the back of the car, pulled out a shovel, and began digging through the snow. His movements were slow, methodical, as if he had all the time in the world. Panic surged through me. My hand hovered over the door handle, my breath coming in short gasps. I had to get out. I had to run. But his words echoed in my mind, a sinister warning that kept me frozen in place. I couldn't stay in the car another second. The sight of him digging through the snow, so calm, so deliberate, made my skin crawl. I yanked the door handle and threw myself into the storm. The cold hit me like a wall, stinging my face and biting at my hands and neck. I stumbled through the deep snow, every step a struggle as the wind howled around me. The sedan sat behind me, its headlights cutting eerie beams into the forest, but I didn't look back. I needed to put distance between myself and whatever that man was planning. My legs grew heavy, my breath ragged, and the cold seeped into my bones. I scanned the road, praying for another car, someone, anyone, to come by and pull me out of this nightmare. The snow whipped across my vision, making it nearly impossible to see. Just as my strength began to falter, another pair of headlights appeared through the swirling storm. A car. Relief flooded me as I stumbled into the road, waving my arms wildly. The vehicle slowed, and as it drew closer, I could make out a younger man behind the wheel. The car stopped, and the driver rolled down the window. He looked to be in his early 30s, with a warm smile that seemed genuine. "You okay, man? Get in!" he called, his voice cutting through the storm. I didn't hesitate. I pulled open the door and collapsed into the passenger seat, shivering uncontrollably. The young driver cranked the heat, and the warmth began to spread through the car, though it felt distant, like my body had forgotten how to feel warm. "Rough night, huh?" the driver said, glancing at me with a curious smile. "You're lucky I came by. Not many folks out on these roads in weather like this. I nodded, too shaken to respond. As the car rolled forward, the snowstorm thickened, the world outside turning into a swirling white abyss. Despite the kindness of the new driver, my nerves remained frayed. Every sound felt amplified: the hum of the heater, the wipers scraping against the windshield, the tires crunching over snow. I found myself glancing into the back seat, half expecting to see another pair of boots hidden beneath a blanket. But the seat was empty. And yet, something still didn't feel right. The snowstorm began to ease as we approached the edge of town. I recognized the layout, the familiar gas station sitting just beyond the turn, but something was different. The streetlights flickered faintly, casting dim, yellow light over the snow-covered roads. The buildings looked the same, but their windows were dark, as if the town had fallen into some strange, silent slumber. "Here you go," the young driver said, pulling up to the gas station. He leaned back in his seat and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You take care now. Safe travels, if it's still you by morning." His words sent a chill down my spine. I stared at him, my heart pounding, but he offered no further explanation. I wanted to ask what he meant, but my body felt heavy, and the last thing I wanted was to stay in that car a moment longer. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold, watching as the car disappeared into the snowy night. The gas station stood before me, empty and still, its sign flickering weakly in the storm. I told myself I was safe, that I'd made it back, but doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. I pushed open the door to the gas station, grateful for the small blast of heat that greeted me. A lone heater hummed in the corner, casting weak warmth into the room. I rubbed my hands together, trying to shake off the cold that still clung to me. For a moment, everything felt normal, just a quiet night in a small-town gas station. I allowed myself a shaky breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease. But as I stepped closer to the counter, something caught my eye. A bench sat against the wall, and on it lay a folded blanket. My heart skipped a beat. The blanket was identical to the one I'd seen earlier, the one in the first car, and poking out from beneath it was a pair of boots. The room felt suddenly smaller, the heater's hum drowning in the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be the same blanket, but it was. I took a step back, my breath coming in short gasps. The warmth from the heater felt distant, unreachable, as if I were still out in the snow. And that's when the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't escaped. Not really. The first driver's words echoed in my mind. It's worse out there than in here. I thought I had outrun whatever nightmare he had planned for me. But maybe I hadn't. Maybe I had only stepped into the next part of it. The boots remained where they were, untouched, waiting, and all I could do was stand there, frozen in place, waiting for the storm to end. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I stepped out of my truck and surveyed the familiar wilderness around me. The forest, with its towering pines and winding trails, had become my refuge. After 30 years as a police detective, this was the only place where the ghosts of unsolved cases couldn't follow, at least not for long. I set up camp at my usual spot, a secluded area far from the main trail. The sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves replaced the hum of city noise I was used to, and for a brief moment I felt the weight on my chest begin to lift. But it wasn't long before the peace was shattered. That evening, I overheard two rangers talking near the trailhead. A college student named Sarah Miller had gone missing from a nearby campsite. They thought she had simply wandered off. Hikers got lost in these woods all the time. But I knew better. Years of chasing criminals had sharpened my instincts. Something about the way they talked about her disappearance didn't sit right with me. I told myself I wouldn't get involved. I had come here to escape, not to chase shadows. But the more I tried to ignore it, the louder the nagging voice in the back of my mind became. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I found Sarah's friends still at the ranger station, answering questions from the park staff. I introduced myself as a retired detective and asked a few questions of my own. Most of the group seemed distraught, but one of them, Ethan, caught my attention. Ethan was different. While the others looked tired and worried, Ethan appeared tense, like a man with a secret. His pack was far too large for a short camping trip, and his responses were clipped and defensive. "She wanders off all the time," he insisted, avoiding my eyes. "She'll be fine. She always does this." The words didn't sit well with me. I'd heard excuses like these before, too polished, too rehearsed. They usually came from people who knew more than they were letting on. I kept my questions polite but persistent, watching his discomfort grow. By the time I left the station, I was certain of one thing: Ethan wasn't telling the whole truth. I spent the rest of the day combing through the woods, following trails most people wouldn't notice. Years of tracking suspects through alleyways and abandoned buildings had given me an eye for small details: bent blades of grass, broken twigs, footprints hidden beneath fallen leaves. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I stumbled upon a hidden campsite. It was well concealed, far off the main trail, as if someone had gone to great lengths to avoid being found. A makeshift shelter sat collapsed against a tree, and scattered belongings lay half buried in the dirt. Among the debris, something glinted in the fading light. I crouched down and picked it up, a bracelet, cheap and worn, but unmistakable. Sarah had been wearing one just like it in the photo the rangers showed me. My pulse quickened. I wasn't just chasing a missing hiker. Someone had kept her here. With the bracelet clenched in my hand, I followed a faint trail leading away from the hidden site. The forest grew darker as night fell, and the path became harder to navigate. But I didn't stop. I knew time was running out. After what felt like hours, I pushed through a wall of thick branches and stumbled into a small clearing. And there she was, Sarah, tied to a tree, her head slumped forward, her breathing shallow. Relief flooded through me as I rushed to her side. She was alive. "Hang on," I whispered, my hands working quickly to untie the ropes. Her wrists were raw from struggling, and her clothes were dirty and torn. I eased her down to the ground, my heart pounding in my chest. But before I could move her, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, Ethan, standing at the edge of the clearing, a knife glinting in his hand. His face twisted with frustration and something far darker. "You shouldn't have come looking," he muttered, taking a step closer. I positioned myself between him and Sarah, my body tense. "It's over," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Walk away now." For a moment, he hesitated, the knife trembling in his hand. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the forest. Even as Ethan disappeared into the forest, I knew this wasn't over. His face, twisted with frustration and guilt, was burned into my mind. Men like Ethan don't just walk away. They wait. They circle back. I helped Sarah to her feet, her body weak and shivering from exhaustion. She leaned heavily on me, barely able to walk. I kept my movements deliberate, my senses heightened. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my pulse quicken. Ethan was out there somewhere, and I knew we were on borrowed time. I held Sarah close and whispered, "We need to move. Now." She nodded weakly, and we began navigating our way back through the forest, every step heavy with tension. The darkness pressed in around us, and the only sound was the crunch of snow beneath our boots. We stumbled through the forest, the path barely visible under the snow. I could feel Sarah faltering, her steps slowing with each passing moment. She needed rest, but there was no time. Every second we spent out here was another opportunity for Ethan to find us. The forest was eerily quiet. Only the occasional gust of wind disturbed the stillness, sending clouds of snow swirling through the air. My instincts screamed that we weren't alone. Ethan might be tracking us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps behind us, just faint enough to blend with the wind. I tightened my grip on Sarah's arm and quickened our pace, forcing myself to stay calm. If I panicked, we'd be dead. The path twisted sharply, and ahead, I saw the faint outline of the main trail. Relief surged through me, but I didn't slow down. Not until we reached safety. We broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the main trail, where two rangers waited with flashlights cutting through the darkness. They rushed toward us as Sarah collapsed into sobs, the weight of her ordeal finally catching up to her. One of the rangers wrapped a blanket around her and led her toward their vehicle. I stayed behind, scanning the edge of the forest, expecting to see Ethan emerge from the shadows. but the woods remained silent and still. The rangers questioned me briefly, but I gave them only the basics. Ethan was out there somewhere, and they needed to search the area. They promised they would, but I knew better. I had seen it too many times before. Men like Ethan vanish into the wilderness, leaving behind nothing but questions. As the rangers drove Sarah to safety, I stood alone on the trail, the night closing in around me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ethan's actions than a simple kidnapping. Something darker lurked beneath the surface, something I might never understand. In the weeks that followed, I tried to move on. I told myself that I had done everything I could, that Sarah was safe, and that was what mattered. But the unanswered questions gnawed at me. I couldn't forget Ethan's face, the frustration, the guilt, the anger, simmering just beneath the surface. And I couldn't forget the feeling in my gut that told me this wasn't just a random kidnapping. There was more to the story, something I hadn't seen, something I might never see. The ghosts of that night joined the others from my years on the force, haunting the edges of my thoughts. I had spent my career chasing monsters, only to realize that some of them don't get caught. Some slip through the cracks, leaving behind only fragments of the truth.